Thanks very much. It's a pleasure, I have to say, to share a platform both with Medea Benjamin, who I last met in Tahrir Square, where both of us were doing our best to assist the business of bringing down the Mubarak dictatorship in 2011, and a pleasure, of course, to be with Jeremy Corbyn. And I've shared many platforms with Jeremy. I look forward to sharing many more. But on this occasion, I simply want to say this, and I say it as someone who never has been, and I'm perfectly sure never will be a member of the Labour Party, but I am proud that Jeremy is standing for the leader of the Labour Party. He's an outstanding... campaigner, and I have to say to his fellow Labour MPs, if he does not get on the ballot for leader of the Labour Party, his standing will not decrease, but yours will. Now, the business in hand, there is a conceivably even more important, unfortunately for all of us, election coming up, and it's the coming election for the President of the United States. And I think it's inconceivable that any result of that election, whether it is Hillary Clinton who is elected, or whether it is a Republican candidate who is elected, possibly that Republican candidate, as I understand it, Medea may know more, could be Jeb Bush, so there will simply be a dynastic contest for the next President of the United States. But whoever wins it, it seems to me, will be more likely to engage the United States in even greater levels of armed conflict around the globe than President Obama has been willing to do. And so the subject in hand is about not just what the next American president might want to do, but what the larger project and the larger configuration of American and its allies' imperial power might be, and therefore what they might be willing to do, and therefore to prepare ourselves to oppose them. I'm going to talk critically about the developments in the Middle East, because despite the other areas that we've described and that Jeremy has mentioned, the Ukraine, the pivot to the Pacific, and so forth, this remains an absolutely critical area. In fact, even as the Americans attempt to pivot to the Pacific, the centrality, the geopolitical centrality, the resource centrality of this region drags them back again and again. There it seems to me, a complex and difficult situation to understand in the Middle East, but in outline I would say it is the result of two failures, two lines of causality running out from recent events which intersect to give us what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. The first failure is, of course, the failure of the war on terror. What the United States and its allies wanted out of the invasion and occupation of Iraq was a stable, pro-business base for operations in the Middle East. Having lost Iran, which was once this, to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, having partially lost influence in Saudi Arabia after the first Gulf War, the business of the project for the new American century, the business, the long-held plan of regime change in Baghdad was to create such a base in Iraq. Now, it is absolutely obvious that whatever happened in the occupation and war in Iraq, a stable, pro-business, pro-Western base of operations did not emerge. In fact, the catastrophic failure of that project is one of the most important lines of causality which is causing the current crisis. As Paul Bremner records in his memoirs, Paul Bremner, the first occupation governor of Iraq after the Iraq War, they deliberately destroyed and dismantled the Iraqi state and set up a sectarian form of government designed even more successfully as it turns out than they could possibly have imagined, but designed to set one section of the Iraqi population against another. The other consequence of the failure of the war in Iraq was willy-nilly, and this is an unintended consequence, of course, as far as the Americans were concerned, the growth of Iran's influence in the region. The failure in Iraq produced willy-nilly, so to say, an increase in Iran's influence in the region. The failure was so total and complete that it has inhibited the Americans from being able to intervene directly on the scale of course they intervene in many other ways, but directly on the scale of shock and awe in the region. This has therefore created not just conditions in which Iran is more influential, but in which all the regional powers, sometimes as more or less direct proxies of the United States, have played a much more powerful role. Saudi Arabia, of course, Turkey, in its turn to the new Ottomanism, as it describes its attempt to influence the region in the wake of the Arab Revolution. So it has created conditions of instability, of complete collapse in Iraq, of a sectarian politics, and it's created conditions in which regional rivalries, the rivalries of the regional powers, have been exacerbated. The second line of causality running out is also the second failure, but much more regrettable one, and that is the failure of the Arab revolutions. The events which began in Tunisia in 2010, which housed their centrepiece, the Egyptian revolution in early 2011, and the removal of Mubarak, now subject, of course, to the counter-revolution under General al-Sisi, and then the revolutions in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Libya, and in Syria have formed another series of events, another line of causality which intersects with the first, with the failure of the war in Iraq, the failure of the war on terror. To understand this, we have to distinguish between two phases of these revolutions. The first revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, and the later ones in March, in Bahrain, in Syria, and in Libya. Between these two, the states concerned, the domestic ruling classes in these areas, and the imperial powers, and very importantly Saudi Arabia as the organising centre of counter-revolution in the Middle East, became much more effective between Tunisia and Egypt on the one hand, and Bahrain, Syria and Libya. The resistance that the revolutions met was more decisive, more military, more aggressive than in the Tunisian and Egyptian cases, and the intervention of Saudi Arabia was direct in the case of Bahrain, sending its own troops to crush and eradicate even the physical area of the Pearl Roundabout in which the revolution had taken place, and in Syria, crucially, to back frustrating Saudi Arabia by the lack of American engagement or ability to find an interlocutor to fuel directly the growth of the Islamic State by funding and arming those forces. In this intersection, in the failure of the occupation of Iraq and in the failure of the Arab revolutions, has created a series of vacuums in which local powers and non-state actors, critically now the sort of descendant of the previous Islamic terrorist organisations, the Islamic State, as a reactionary and counter-revolutionary force, have become much more powerful than even the Americans, who did foresee this development, could have imagined in their early analyses. So the prospect here, to bring it back to the question of the return from the Neocons, is this: that they have now reduced in sequence three areas of the region, three countries in the region, to rubble. The Syrian state in its utter state of collapse and civil war, the Iraqi state in a state of collapse and civil war, the growth of the Islamic State across the border of those two states, and Libya in an equal state of collapse. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which set up the borders of the Middle East in the wake of the First World War, is dissolving in chaos in the Middle East. There will be a limit to to the time when the still dominant imperial power can watch this happen without greater levels of involvement. That possibility, I think, is going to open up before the next American president. Possibly it will open up under conditions where there is a regional war. Because what we see in the Yemen, in the direct intervention of Saudi Arabia, in continuing airstrikes on a neighbouring country, in an attempt by Saudi to react to the growth of Iranian influence. And this, you don't have to be particularly imaginative to see growing into a regional conflict from which the regional powers will, be engaged against one another, and from which the major powers will not be able to stand aloof. This is a more frightening prospect even than the original war on terror. In the original war on terror, the major powers banded together and attacked minor powers in the system. Goliath attacked David, tiny powers in the system, by comparison militarily and economically. This is a more dangerous scenario than the one before, and one from which imperial power will not be able to continue in the state of semi-paralysis, semi-limbo that it has done under Barack Obama's presidency. This is a configuration which the peace movement needs to study, which the anti-war movement needs to analyse, and for which we need to prepare in future for even larger mobilisations than those that we've had in the past.